Awesome. Well, friends, thank you for making time out of your busy day to be here with us. I can't really imagine anything more important to think about than how grief and loss impacts us as individuals, our communities, and indeed our whole society and world right now. So thank you so much for the work of the NSHPCA and for Ann and Tim inviting me to be here. I really think this is an important subject, obviously, and I think you do too. So let's get into it. Before we do, I really do want to acknowledge I have no idea what you're bringing into the digital room right now. So I want to acknowledge that one of the things we frequently don't do with grief is really learn to listen to what our bodies are telling us about our reaction to grief and loss. So listen to your body through the presentation today. And if you need to take time to turn off your camera, to walk away, to mute me because something is being stirred up in you and you need to respond to that, you do you, and make sure you know that you're in the driver's seat for that and aren't judged at all for it. Part of the presentation, I will reference the mass casualty, natural disasters. There are some images of global events that I don't think are very graphic or violent necessary in any way. And like I said, I don't know your context. And so I want to give you the power to choose and to let you know that that is coming, right? So that you can make the choices that you need to make. So as we begin, I'm curious, and it's just a hypothetical question for all of us to just consider what comes to mind when you hear or see that word grief. Like, I wonder what images or thoughts, emotions, how does your body react when you begin to reflect on that word? And I think one of the things that's pretty popular out there for a lot of us, it won't take many of us long before we start to talk in this way, which I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with, that there are these stages of grief, the five stages that we hear about a lot in our culture and society, that we start at denial, we're a hot mess, and we end up just like perfect people at the end of acceptance, like nothing ever happened, right? You go in one end, you come out the other in less than a year, and it's all great. I mean, that's a bit of a co-opting, to put it lightly, of the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was an absolute pioneer and innovator in breaking open grief and loss into the popular conversation in her work in the 60s and 70s, especially. And Kubler-Ross was really studying a very particular experience. People at the end of their life who are actively dying with serious illness. And people have taken that, our culture has taken that idea of stages of grief and very much expanded on it and applied it to all kinds of grief in a way that I think honestly would mortify Kubler-Ross, that it's being applied in the way that it often is in culture. And if you think, Matt, you're understating this a little bit, well, there's no bigger influencer out there than Taylor Swift. Her concerts changed the GDP of industrialized nations. And so Swift created a stages of grief playlist for heartbreak, right? That are mapped on to those five stages of grief. So just, I mean, honestly, consider in social and cultural how far this idea has worked its way into our everyday lives, that a lot of Generation Z, let alone millennials, are reinforcing this idea all the time. It's all around us being echoed on the internet and in popular culture that there's this way of experiencing grief. It looks like this. It's clearly established that this is how it works. You start here, you end there, and it's resolved. So when I think about what comes to my mind when I hear the word grief, this is where my heart goes. It doesn't go immediately to person loss. And I understand why we're drawn to that, to the death of a person, especially the loss of life, particularly if it's been under tragic circumstances. But I want to pull the camera back for us to consider, if you're asking yourself these days, as many people are, why are people doing the things they're doing? Why are they behaving the ways they're behaving? Look at this cataclysmic menu of crises that are facing humanity right now, that us as individuals, as communities, as countries are living in. The economic crisis, the refugee crisis, which has never seen greater migration in the history of humanity than right now, the homelessness and addiction crisis, the crisis of are we entering or on the tipping point of World War III? The crisis of the climate and all the issues that spin out from that, the crisis of human rights and who gets them and who should not get them, or what populations should receive extra privileges and what should be taken away. The way that we react to this is grief, because all of this is loss. And it's one of the things that is lacking from the conversation and also from the way that we plan strategically together as communities and as systems. We don't think about loss in this way. Look at that list. That is a profound impact. That is the landscape we're living and working in. And it's paying attention to that that is so important. So when we think about grief, I always say, where are we going to find it? Wherever there are people, there's going to be grief because loss is a constant, not an exception of the human condition. So, practical everyday example here, my friends. I'm at the grocery store. I like to treat cashiers as human beings and not as a mode of transaction. So that's why I choose them over the self-checkout. So I'm asking this cashier, how you doing? How's your day? How's your shift been going? At the mention of the shift ending, she says to me, I have to get out of here and go as fast as I can to the Dixon building for my mom's chemo because I don't know how long she has left to live. I'm really worried we're at the end of the clock for my mom. I'm just checking out bread and eggs. And we're talking about the end of life for her mother at the grocery store. Grief is always on stage. It might be center, it might be waiting in the wings, it might be in the back room like it was for her. But given the opportunity, it comes front and center because loss is a constant. All of us experience loss as part of the human condition the longer we live. And I think I have colleagues from the IWK here who would tell you that even infants have been shown through research to experience loss and to also have a reaction of grief. At every stage of our existence as humans, grief and loss are part of it. And I just want to take this moment to step back and to really ponder this piece right here of the landscape we're all living in Nova Scotia. I don't think anybody is more attuned to the impact of loss and grief than our colleagues in Colchester and East Hants, than our neighbors and our friends and our fellow Nova Scotians who are living there. Yes, the province feels the impact of the worst mass shooting in Canadian history, but no one more so, and in ways that my words will never be able to truly capture, nor will I be able to ever honor as it should be, the extent to which this has impacted people's lives. We're coming up on the fifth year anniversary of the mass shooting. Can you believe that? And it occurred in the midst of a global pandemic that is unlike any experience any other human has had because the world has never been so interconnected and interdependent as we are at this time. Research alone will tell us that those two events will have generational consequences, not a year, not 5 years. Generations of people's lives will feel the effects of these two events alone and how it's profoundly shaped us. Then pile on the cumulative losses of the Snowbirds crash, HMCS Fredericton, residential schools and unmarked graves. Think of Black Lives Matter and how it's affected our African Nova Scotian community here in Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia wildfires, back-to-back floods that saw the loss of life of very young people. The Desmond Inquiry's final report. All of us could make this list longer of the constant, unexpected loss and community violence that we can name and add to this list. I'm not doing this to make you depressed when you go back to work right now. I'm doing this because it's a reality check about the gravity of loss and grief and trauma and how it's been pigeonholed into one part and one experience in our society when we really need to be thinking it on a much broader and systemic scale. So when we don't respond to grief and loss appropriately or effectively after trauma and after tragedy, we know this, and this is a tiny snapshot of research. We're going to see increased mental health issues. We're going to see social fragmentation, economic decline, escalation of violence and crime, including domestic violence, intergenerational trauma, reduced civic engagement, chronic grief, because there's no way to metabolize all that energy around the trauma and the loss. It has nowhere to go. And this is true of any level of population density. But when we're talking about rural areas where that degree of separation is so small, which is the case for this province, the effects are even more magnified. So yes, we can say that only a certain percentage of the population will often experience PTSD. But as is the case always with grief and loss and tragedy, context and individual experience is everything. There are no simple metrics for that. One study concluded of a mass shooting that they could show that 26 years after the event, people were saying, I've got experienced levels of depression and anxiety. There's a marked reduction in social support, and that they have post-traumatic effects of being able to even create new relationships that allow them to form the attachments they need to live a deep, rich, and meaningful life or just get through the day. So, what's wrong with this way that we talk about grief in our popular culture? Pretty much everything in my mind. We've always got to be humble about grief, but I feel pretty certain about this, and the research will back it up. This mountain of grief we treat like it kind of falls from the sky, drops into our lives. It's an anomaly, it's strange. And just like we say of Everest, we climb it because it's there. We have no other choice. And no wonder we're attracted to these 5 stages because it's a nice, neat map to get me through what could basically be described as a hellish experience for most human beings as quickly as possible. Who wouldn't want to say there's a quick way to get through your grief and it's very clear about what you can do to get there, to get back to a place where everything is great again? It just doesn't work this way when we ponder our loss. Would we say to somebody, as I've met before, I'll use this example, parents whose child has just died in a tragic car accident on their way to work, when I walk in and meet that family, at any time would I say to them, I know this is awful now, but in less than a year, you're going to go through these phases. It's all going to make sense and you're going to feel better. It doesn't accurately reflect the experience and the just depth of their trauma and grief. Yet we can't just use a cookie cutter formula for grief and loss and tragedy and trauma. It doesn't work. Don't take my word for it. Research, here's a sweeping study of grief theory where they concluded, hey, stage theory actually does harm to grievers because stages don't occur and they don't occur in a chronological way, and nor does everybody experience any or all of these things. We've got to shelve this and say this was really important. There are things we've learned from it. But gosh, there's been 50, 60 years of research. There are other ways of relating to grief and loss that we need to start to take into account. So why is grief this messy? And it's not this simple thing that we can just address in one way for everybody. Well, I like to think about it this way. Even twins don't have identical fingerprints. And so it is with grief. Your grief is the imprint left by everything that makes up the experience of your loss. Both my parents have died. Maybe you share that experience, but our relationships with those people and the way that our personhood has been shaped around how we grieve and how we attach or experience the loss of attachment is so unique. We could never, it's apples and oranges, right? There's no sweeping statement that can put us in the same simple definition of how we experience that loss. So that's really important to remember. And this is reflected in the Canadian consciousness too. It's a small sample size, but at least it's representative of people right across the country. And look at what we're seeing from Grief Alliance here. We see what's helpful. A compassionate community approach is helpful for a lot of different kinds of grief. It's not enough for all the kinds of grief and trauma that Canadians face, but it's one way that's helpful we see reflected here. We see there's a huge chunk of people who are like, I can't tell anybody about my loss because they just think I was making it up, that it's perceived and not real. Loss is always real to the person experiencing it, whether anybody else considers it perceived or not. And then look at that bottom right-hand corner. When Canadians have been accessing healthcare systems, employer resources like EAP or helplines, there's a gap. They're not getting the support that they need. We've got to learn and work towards a different way of relating to grief and loss together, a way that spans health systems and community organizations, individuals, and communities. So I really like this definition of grief. This is thanatologist Rochelle Bensoussan. She's wrote this amazing book that just got released. I highly recommend it, folks. Take a look and read it. It's well worth your time. And Rochelle talks about loss as being the severing of someone or something to whom we've held great attachment. So you and I, when we were born, we are completely dependent on the village around us, and particularly on our parent, in this case, our mother. That's why the team will place the baby on mom's chest, because right away, research has shown how important it is for an infant to start to form those attachments. They're going to create bonds of safety, meaning, and security as we live and grow. We know just how much that impacts how you are going to develop as a human being. It is essential. And as we age and move through life, those attachments are essential to us being able to live a deep and rich and meaningful life as a human being. So when we experience the severing of that, someone suddenly dies, or whether we anticipate it or not, it's like a bone breaking. Suddenly we can't access that attachment anymore. And that causes this grief reaction, which is both embodied and involuntary. And those two words are important. Embodied in that grief impacts every level of your personhood, and involuntary in that you don't have a choice with that. You don't choose to grieve a loss. So, the example I use to relate to this is twofold. One is to say, on the call, if a bear barged in from the woods outside my house right now, my CNS, my central nervous system, is going to react because my brain is hardwired to protect me and to perceive that's a threat. Here's what we're going to do in order to protect ourselves from the bear. I at no point am going to sit here and go, hold on, Bear. I'm on a conference call. I'll deal with the existential threat you're presenting to me right now as soon as I get through with them. But that's how we treat grief. That, hey, here's a few days of bereavement leave. Hey, here's a bereavement policy of however long. We're assuming you've done the work to integrate that loss, but now you can come back to work and work double shifts and deal with all the intensity of managing your life and your finances and all the things you need to do as a person. You're good, right? You can choose to put your grief to the side. For our healthcare providers, for community providers, for volunteer folks, they can relate. That does not make sense to their experience of loss. So, grief is an embodied response, just like our central nervous system. There's a way that our whole person responds to this that we don't choose. So, what if we thought about grief differently? And I like Tonkin's model for this. None of them are perfect, but I like this one because we do have this propensity to say that grief is just going to disappear over time. And Tonkin says, wait a minute, what if our loss is part of us? It changes our sense of self. So we carry that loss in some way. And when we have support and we relate to our grief and that experience with support and with hard work, maybe our lives can grow around that loss so that we make the room for new attachments. Not that we can reattach with what's lost in our lives, but we need to find new ways of creating meaning in our lives to be able to get through the day, to do the things we need to do as human beings. So grief and loss, it can apply to anyone or anything that's significant to you. It's not a predictable process. It doesn't have a set timeline or endpoint. No two people grieve in the same way. It impacts your whole personhood, and grief takes many shapes. There's really not a wrong way to grieve in this right stage way to grieve. So normal grief, I don't know about normal. I don't really think it applies, but grief can look so different. So if you can feel it as an emotion, that's not a moral judgment. It's not morally right or wrong to feel a particular way. It's your body reacting to stimulus. Like that's just what your brain and your body does with emotions. What we add to meaning after, that's a whole other conversation for another day of those emotions. But just to say all of this is possible and none of it's possible. You may not feel any of these things. Your brain is wired to carry more than one emotion at the same time. So it's realizing we don't live in that binary world when it comes to our emotions. People do feel all kinds of things. They have all kinds of experiences around how they're able to focus or not. I remember when my dad died of pancreatic cancer, I couldn't find the milk one day because I put it in the cupboard instead of the fridge. I could never find my keys. And when I'd go driving, I would sometimes forget where I was actually going. That's grief. All of that is quite expected and frequent for grievers. Um, where we look at traumatic grief a bit to the conversation earlier is to say when people have suicidal ideation, they can't go to work, they can't do the things they need to do in their life, they might be doing self-harm, overly relying, deeply relying on alcohol and drugs to cope because the trauma of the experience is pushing them all the time beyond the ability to regulate and cope with what they're facing. These are some of the signs, and there are so many that we would look for to say this requires a different level of response. So is there like an average grief? I guess in the sense that over time or with work and support, we hope that the presentation of these things would decrease in their intensity and duration for people so they can get into living the kind of life they want to live. And that's where grief literacy comes in as one way that we can work together to raise this understanding. So we look at it less as starting as a disease or an illness that somebody's living with, that there's something wrong with you for reacting this way, and starting from This is normal for us to grieve loss. It's as normal as breathing. So let's talk about this. Let's open space around this for you to experience this. And that's more of a preventative approach. One of the ways that we metabolize that energy, and I'm almost done here for Tim to get on with the meeting, is to just say that just like with breathing, we take something from outside, we bring it into our lungs, we take what we need from that, becomes part of our body, and then we breathe out the CO2. We experience the loss, we bring it in, we do the metabolizing, it changes who we are, and then there's some of that that's released so that we can create the room for new attachments. And mourning is some of the ways that we do this about how we externalize what's going on internally with us. And that's so key in generating compassion. And that's the ability and willingness to empathize without judgment and to face pain. And in the world today, in our lives, in our communities, I think we're at a deficit with compassion in a big way. You're not pre-wired for compassion. You've got to learn how to do it, teach how to do it, reinforce how to do it. And that's why I'm such a big fan of compassionate communities as one of the many ways we respond to grief, in that we treat cycles of sickness and health, birth and death, love and loss as everyday occurrences, not as something that is somehow unusual. And then in a compassionate community, we all have a role, including healthcare professionals or experts, to play in supporting one another. That's so important to the work that NSHPCA is doing and all of our community providers is engaged in as well. So here's where I want to leave you today, is that one of the most common responses to grievers is going to be they present their grief, they're vulnerable, and however they present, and someone feels should really talk to somebody about that, which is really a way of honestly saying, I feel like I'm not equipped to actually help you, to fix you. Grief doesn't need to be fixed. It's an experience, not a problem. It's not a disease. It's part of the human condition. So can we change that to say loss is constant, not an exception? Grief is an experience we all go through, not a stage, and compassion is a verb, not a noun. This is normal. I'm here too, and I'm listening. Thank you, friends, so much for your time, and good luck with your annual general meeting.
Thank you, Matt. Anne, you're just on mute there. Thank you so much, Matt. That was a really great presentation. I think Anne's just finding the button there.
Yes, I would like to say a few words on behalf of everyone.
Thank you.
Matthew, I was looking forward to listening to you, and I found as I was driving